A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
Okay, so last time we did an episode on morality systems, and the idea of a morality system, and if you haven't watched the episode, go check it out. It should be really interesting. The idea of a morality system is essentially that you count morality somehow, right? Games have this desire sometimes to incorporate an element of morality, to incorporate the moral dimension of life into gameplay. But, games usually like to count things. And morality systems try to count these things. So we talked about karma systems like the Knights of the Old Republic, where essentially there are choices that you make and they get counted as good or bad. And you kind of move along that way and the story changes along with that. We talked about alignment systems where you add to the morality scale this other kind of dimension, let's say, where you're chaotic or lawful. We talked about reputation systems where you're not counting morality, but you're counting what it is that people think of you, right? And you need to think about what people think of you. And we talked about the possibility of games like The Witcher 3, where there's lots of opportunities for ethical reflection, but no morality system at all, right? Okay, so we want to start today by going a little bit outside of games. So Andy, can you think of anywhere outside of games where maybe we can get inspiration for how someone might try to count like good, bad, wrong, right, and wrongness?
Sure. So outside of games, we can look at things like a criminal justice system, for example, where your record is your history of your history of bad choices, bad moral choices is recorded.
And your record, of course, is, right, A, the record of your choices, but B, also the record of judgments against you. We morally judge people all the time, right? So,
all the time.
Right, and if
I'm doing it right now.
By the way, of course, we also morally judge people for judging people too much.
Oh, right.
And in social media, we see this all the time. And it's interesting because part of what we talk about in social media is, how wrong is that wrong thing that somebody did? Or is it wrong? And if so, right? And the one thing about criminal justice is that we have to come up to an actual decision because there's going to be a punishment. And that punishment has to be quantified. Right? Unless it's the death penalty, right? But if
even that is a quantified thing, right? It's one death.
You could, but it's not like you can kill you twice, right? I mean, it's
right.
But when you're looking at, like, let's say, fine, right? You committed a crime. How much should we fine you? Well, the idea is we're going to look at, well, how wrong, right, is what you did, and at least that's typically the way we look at it. That's not always the way the law can look at it. The law can look at it as in a more utilitarian way, and we could talk about that later. But typically is, oh, you did this, it's, this bad. Let's give it a 3, right?
Right.
So we're going to fine you $3,000, but, he did this and it's 10 bad, and he's going to get like $10,000 fine.
Right. And it's sort of interesting because those fines are they're not meant to be punishment. They're meant to be deterrences.
Well, it's interesting. They could be either one, and
punishment is always meant to be deterrence. Like that's the point of punishment is to be a deterrence.
Actually, there's two views on this, and they really disagree about it, right? So, and they kind of correspond to, and they both count, right? I mean, they both count in the sense of they both need to count something, right? So, those people who think that the criminal justice system is for deterrence, so this is kind of the utilitarian theory of punishment. The whole point of punishment is to bring about a better society, right? A safer society, right? We'll punish people and but we're only justified in punishing them to the point where it's going to produce overall good for society, right? So we still want to punish them enough, but now enough is going to be counting the potential consequences that they have in terms of the good. Right? But then you have other people that say, well, no, I mean, the whole point of criminal justice is to give people what they deserve, right? And the punishment should fit the crime.
But why would you want to do that?
Because justice demands it, right? It's the idea of.
But but doesn't that ultimately serve the same purpose, to make society better?
Not necessarily. You might say, in fact, it's easy.
That feels like it's just a step on those. It's just another step on the way towards making a better society, is make sure that people get what they deserve.
Well, it depends. So when you say better society, better according to which kind of vision? According to the retributivist vision, better is when the scales of justice are balanced, right?
Sure.
So it's, in that case, that's better. If you're utilitarian, you're looking at better is, let's say, most people feeling happier.
Sure.
Right. And it's possible.
Right.
But it's possible that you can get a situation where, let's say, if you punish someone, it will upset a lot of people, even though they deserve the punishment.
Of course.
Right? And in that case, the retributivist, the person who wants the people to get what they deserve, is going to say, you got to do it anyway, even if it's going to lead to negative social consequences. And the utilitarian might say, don't punish that person, or don't punish them as harsh, even if they deserve it, because we're going to get better. It's going to lead to negative social consequences.
Right. Okay, sure.
So there is disagreement, even though most people try to put them together. At least in principle, there's a disagreement.
Right. And in the United States, what we try to do is we try to say these disagreements shouldn't be part of the process. These disagreements should be part of the legislative process to figure out what the law is.
Right.
And then once it gets to the criminal case, it's the law just decides.
Right. So here we are. We're members of the jury. You now need to decide, right? Whatever. Right. Whatever.
But you're not deciding whether or not somebody should be punished. That's not what the juries are for.
Right.
Juries are only for deciding what is and isn't a fact in the case.
And for sentencing, I believe.
And for sentencing.
Right. So and so we're thinking in the sentencing part. Right?
Okay.
Right. For sentencing, right?
So we know we've already determined that a crime has occurred.
Right.
And so now we're just talking about
how much.
Right. How much. And I think there's a third argument for punishment, which is that it's really about protecting the rest of society from the criminal. It's not about changing the criminal in some way or punishing the criminal. It's not punitive. It's just we need to protect society from this person who does bad things.
Right. Which is also a form of utilitarianism in a way, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but definitely, right, to do all this, because the idea of the law, right, the law is supposed to be good. The law is supposed to be reflective of morality, right? So notice we are actually quantifying in some way good or bad in the law, or at least in punishments, when we're trying to determine punishments. The idea here is that the punishment should fit the crime. Right. So we need to think about how bad was your crime and what is the appropriate way to quantify that in time in jail, let's say. Right. And we try to do that. And it's not perfect. And obviously we can disagree about it.
Right. And I think that honestly, the reason it's not perfect is because the premise is wrong. I mean, this is my own personal politics on it. Right. Of course. But the idea that a punishment should fit the crime is itself probably the wrong way to think about it. The better way to think about it, perhaps, is how can we prevent this crime from happening again?
Okay, that's justice, right? Are there anywhere else outside of games that we do this?
Religion. I mean, different religions handle this differently, right? Catholicism. You count sins. There are specific things that are sins, and then there are specific things you can do to absolve yourself from these sins.
You're weighing the good and the bad, right?
Right, and that was ancient Egyptian too. The idea that your heart was weighed
in a binary way too. right? That you're weighing, and of course, the karmic system in Buddhism and Hinduism also kind of is like a karmic justice where you're weighing these two forces of good and bad, right? So in a way, we're kind of used to it, and games are maybe, they're not alone here in trying to systemize, right, good and bad. Let me add just one more really quick to this. Economics measures good and bad all the time. With economics essentially tries to quantify everything, right? And the idea of you're quantifying everything to see, you're looking at the potential consequences and you're looking at what would be good or bad consequences. And we've talked about that in a previous episode. I think it was episode 6 or maybe 7, I think. Right? We talked about utilitarianism, and economics essentially is utilitarianism for the most part. Or I shouldn't reduce the field of economics to utilitarianism. It's obviously way, way, way more complicated, but it's at least aspiring to a utilitarian ideal. So in utilitarianism, we're trying to quantify everything. So here's a kind of a typical way that it would work, right? I have two choices, and we can think about this hopefully in a video game context in a second, right? I have two choices. Utilitarianism is going to tell me to pick the one that is going to bring about the greatest good, the best consequences. When deciding between my choices, for each one, I need to look at, let's say, who is it going to impact? And for each way it's going to impact person, how is it going to impact them in terms of, let's say, the intensity of the pleasure or pain that it's going to cause them, right? And then the duration of that pleasure or pain that it's probably going to cause them, right? Like, how long is it going to be, right? And then the probability of this. And I kind of add all that together, and that tells me what the impact is going to be on that one person. And I do that for everybody that's going to be impacted, and then I have a kind of calculable way to figure out what the best thing is to do.
Go on.
So essentially, right, if I'm looking at your actions, and let's say your actions is you need to decide if you should, there's a creature. I'm putting myself in the world of The Witcher 3 right now, let's say, and there's a monster of some kind, and he's been terrorizing the villagers, and the villagers want me to kill him. But when I actually meet the monster, he himself is being plagued by a different problem, and if I kill him, let's say, his family will die. Right, but if I don't kill him, let's say he'll go and keep killing villagers.
Right.
So with the utilitarian approach, right, the idea would be that I'm going to look at both of those options. Let's say kill him, don't kill him, and of course there's always potentially other options if there are, right? And I'm going to tabulate all that stuff. Like, what is the pain? Right? What is the intensity? How sure I am of these consequences? Because you never really know what the consequences are going to be. And then you choose and that tells you what the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do. And there's always a right and wrong thing to do, and they're based on the consequences.
That's interesting because that doesn't feel very realistic, does it?
There's obviously problems with it, right?
Yeah. Because it was making me think, while you were describing it, I was thinking about when we go and vote on state propositions.
Okay.
We
do this in California.
We do this in California quite a lot. California has a lot of, but even frequently, other places also have propositions that go on ballots that are not necessarily led by the voters, as a lot of Californians are. But even so, some organization will write very unbiased or try to be unbiased. Here's the results. Here's what we expect the results of this law to be.
Right.
If it goes into, and then there's debate about whether or not how to weigh each of those things. Right. Like, this will cost us this much money, but it'll provide this many jobs right now. But the cost of that much money means that the state has to borrow, and this is frequently a California issue. The state has to borrow more money,
right.
And so we're going to be paying for that down the road, and our children are going to be paying for that, and our grandchildren are going to be paying for that, and that's bad. So there's this weighing of whether or not these things are, which of these things is more good or more bad,
Well, this seems to be where utilitarianism might be good here, right?
Oh yeah,
Right?
no, but it ultimately comes down to individual voters deciding, the actual weight of the good and the bad on any of these different results,
Though we
as opposed to a computer just saying this is a good thing, this is a bad thing.
Right. Though let's talk about how a computer might do that, right? Giving so if you're thinking about designing a game, right? So, right, as a designer, right, you're going to program the computer to make those kinds of determinations. How can you use a morality system like that's purely based on utilitarianism?
So what I would think about doing is I would think about um, the AI of how it decides how much weight to give any of the different consequences. So there's going to be, you're going to do this thing, you're going to do this thing or not do this thing. The action of doing this thing provides these consequences. The action of not doing this thing provides these consequences. What weight should we give them? How important are some of these things?
Interesting. So you're thinking you've already got the consequences, but you're thinking about how to give the consequences weight. And I realize
Right.
we never. So utilitarianism has a normal kind of way of doing that. So maybe this will
Okay.
help.
Oh,
So
good.
because yeah, this is part of the problem, right? And again, I think we talked about this in day 7. It's one thing to say that something is good. It's another thing to say, well, okay, how do you decide what's good and how do you quantify that, right?
Hmm.
So in this case, classic utilitarianism says pleasure is good, pain is bad,
Right.
right? So we can look at what happy, warm and fuzzies have you given to people versus made them suffer, and and we can have a scale. Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, has a scale that says essentially the more you want something as opposed to not having a feeling at all, the
Hmm.
higher the intensity is, right,
Okay.
of that, right? So, and the more you want something not to happen, you think about pain, right? Pain is something you
Yeah.
just don't want to happen. The more you
Right.
want it not to happen, the worse pain it is. And we can figure that into our calculation. Right?
Okay.
So when we're talking
Right. Right.
about, right, the AI calculating the consequences in terms of how you should measure them, that's one way to do it by how much pain or pleasure will be caused. Another is by desire fulfillment, like how
Hmm.
much people will get what they want and what they don't want.
Right. But what I'm talking about is the comparing individual things between one another requires them to be weighted two different ways, right? One is by, its goodness or badness,
Okay.
and another is by how much you care.
Right. Right. Which
And I feel like those are orthogonal to one another. Those are two axes that don't have anything to do with one another.
Well, in
I mean,
utilitarianism, they do, because by definition, suffering for you, right, is going to be, making you do things that you really don't want to happen. So the
yeah,
more suffering, the more you care by definition,
by
right?
definition.
Right.
Okay.
That's the idea. It's a very clever way
Okay.
of kind of putting
So
those
what it
things
means
together.
is that for each individual person making a judgment, the consequences are very different, because I might not care about one consequence, but I might care very much about another consequence.
You're right, and it's totally subjective, right? So
Right.
so let's say we have two characters in our game, right?
Hmm.
And we rob each one. Let's say we rob 50. We take 50 gold pieces. We steal 50 gold pieces from each one, right?
Right.
One might be devastated by it. The other one might not care that much,
Right.
right? At least we can imagine these are all NPCs, right?
Right. Right. Of course.
Right. Though even if they're players, that might be the case,
Right.
right? And utilitarianism is fully subjective as far as that goes. It just cares about your subjective experience. So what do you do if you're a programmer and are you going to pre-program the subjective experience of how much an NPC is going to care?
You can. You absolutely can. And in fact, modern AIs can do this very well.
Hmm.
You can give any, you can say this action is going to be judged by 10,000 AIs.
Okay.
And each of these AIs, we could even say each of these AIs has got a list of things that they care about in a hierarchy.
Okay.
They tend to care about these things more than other things. And so we can literally say, all right, 10,000 AIs, how bad was this? How bad was this action?
And they could figure it out for us.
And they will group all of their, each one will come to a decision. You'll gather all the decisions from all 10,000 of them, and then, average them out or whatever, however you want to do it. And you'll get a score.
Right. And notice what's really nice about this is that seems especially good for populations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, right, let's say I'm thinking of a game like Fable 3, right? So, right, in Fable 3, when you are the king, right, you need to make all these decisions that are going to, they're really, right, these tough moral dilemmas. You made a promise to people. People are going to get hurt. Bad things are going to happen. And, here you've got a way to kind of measure the bad. It's interesting because, well, okay, we'll get to more of that in a second, but you've got a way of measuring. The AIs will figure out how many, let's say, elves there are, or dwarves. I think there's dwarves or something like that in Fable 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
How many of them are there in this area related to your action? And we'll have the AIs do a kind of random analysis and come up with a number, and that's going to be the outcome of the consequences. And
it doesn't even have to be random. You could actually just query each of these dwarves and find out what each one cares about. Does this one care about this? Okay, it does. So how is it pro or against? This one doesn't care about it at all. Okay, zero that guy out.
Great. So this way we use a desire fulfillment kind of model, right? To see what it is that they want.
Sure.
All right. Though it's interesting because we would still want to know how much do they care about it.
Right. Well, that's the hierarchy. Like they care about it more than this. They care about more than that. So you would need to have these hierarchies because there's always more than one consequence to anything.
So
that you're judging.
Right. And to me that sounds pretty good, at least for a start. Though it seems harder if you're talking about two people. I'm willing to accept that with populations, right?
Mm-hmm.
People are going to want kind of different things, and there'll be some variety. If you have two people in front of me and I need to make a decision between them, and, I don't know exactly what their, programmed desire functions are. And then
what am I'm choosing between them for what? What am I choosing?
Good question. How about this? You need to choose between them. They both want you to hire them to be a mercenary on your crew, let's say. Right?
Okay.
And they both give you sob stories about why, they really needed the job, which mercenaries with sob stories are not that uncommon, but let's just go with that. I'm making this up as I go along, Handy.
We'll run with it.
Right.
I'm with you.
Right. And you need to decide which one to do. And let's say there are going to be consequences for this. Right. And they're talking about, let's say, their families. They both give you sob stories about their families back home. It seems like it would be very hard for you to anticipate what is good or what is bad in terms of these choices, in terms of consequences that have to do with the inner thinking of these characters that you know nothing about.
Right. And honestly, you also don't know how truthful they're being, right?
Right.
So let's assume that you've got them under a truth spell.
Okay.
So they're telling you exactly the truth.
Right.
So you're absolutely sure about everything that they're telling you.
Right. Even with this, right? And let's say under this truth serum, you can also ask them, hey, how much do you care about this? You can even get all the calculations you need from it, right? Even with all that, and that would be a ridiculous way to, completely unrealistic, right? To make which is interesting, right? When we make ethical decisions, of course, we're expected to put ourselves in the minds of real people and think about the consequences it's going to, have to them and how they're going to interpret it. But of course, we're expected to also have a.
Well, so I have a question about utilitarianism then, because it sounds like utilitarianism cares about the consequences to each of these people. But really, I only care about the consequences to me. so let's say the sob story given to me by mercenary A is that if I don't give him the job, his wife is going to be eaten by sharks.
Great.
Consequence for the mercenary B gives me a consequence and says, if he's not given the job, his wife is going to die of starvation. Now the things I care about become very important, because I might have a stronger feeling about how one should die.
Interesting. Though it's interesting, right? I mean, you're trying to, again, if we take utilitarianism here, right? Utilitarianism is going to look for the overall good, and that includes your good, right? So it's looking for everybody impacted, and your impact matters just as much as theirs. So if, let's say, it was a tie between them, I'm thinking about the suffering involved in starvation and of being eaten by a shark. Personally, I think that starvation would end up causing more suffering just because it takes longer. Even though being eaten by a shark would be more painful to begin with, there would be less overall. But
and terrifying.
And terrifying. But it would be fairly short. Right? So you got to calculate all that stuff. But you would also need to calculate it with utilitarianism, the impact this would have on you. Let's say you can live better with someone dying from starvation than being eaten by a shark. That would matter also to the utilitarian, though that would be a really weird way to do this in a game. Right? I mean, right.
Well, and that's why I think in a game you would have some sort of hierarchy. There would be no ties.
Right.
There would be something in the game that would break the tie.
Right. Maybe.
Like I think that dying from starvation is more suffering. Is like you in your case, the tiebreaker would be dying of starvation causes more suffering, in your opinion, than being eaten by a shark. You don't know. You've never done either. You've never died by starvation or been eaten by a shark, so you don't really know.
Of course not. Right.
You just have a hierarchy. You just have an internal hierarchy of.
I wouldn't call it an internal hierarchy. I've reasoned it out, right? I've looked at their cases and I've reasoned out their cases. Though I mean, it's interesting how
Well, this is exactly what's going to happen. There's no question that.
Well, at least they're telling
that this will happen.
They're telling the truth. I don't actually know that even if they're telling the truth, technically speaking, they can't control the universe, right? I mean,
this is a fantasy world. This is absolutely a fantasy world. So let's say that they have been told by a truth teller that if they don't get this job, this is what will happen.
I see. Okay, so we're going.
And the truth teller is right. So let's get rid of all of this like, well, I don't really know business.
Sure.
This is exactly what's going to happen.
It's all been foretold.
It's all been foretold. You have no reason to, except your choice.
Yes. Right. Which is interesting because, of course, that is about as far as from real life as you can get. Right. We're making this choice. Right.
Right. In real life, we have all these like uncertainties.
Right. And of course, when you look at people like economists, right, they try to kind of uncover the probabilities involved in these uncertainties to try to get kind of closer to what the consequences would be. Now, look, I think there's,
and in a tabletop sort of role-playing game, like where you actually have some agency on more than just a binary choice, you can say, all right, well, I'm going to give the shark attack mercenary the job, but I'm going to send somebody with food. I'm going to send the other one home with food.
Right. That's right. So you have
I'm going to do. You have extra options, right?
Is there, is it possible to have extra options like this in a video game?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, of course.
Right.
The more it comes down to granularity, right? And programming time and all of these sorts of things. So when it comes down to it, yes, everything is possible. It just takes time.
Sure. Right. So like in this case, let's say you just happen to have the possibility of giving items to anyone, and one of those items could be food, and in your list of people appears the wife of this person, right? I mean that would be that would do it. Okay,
Right.
So, okay, so that's kind of one way to do it. It's not, beside the problems we've already talked about, there's a few other problems, but one I think particularly matters, right? That we're only talking about consequences. We're only looking at whether you ended up taking the action that will bring about the most good, but we don't care why you did it, right? I mean, you could be doing the right thing for the wrong reason.
Right.
And the system just wouldn't get that, right? It would still say,
Correct.
oh, you're moral, you totally did, when you could have just been doing it for selfish reasons.
Maybe I just like the idea of watching somebody getting eaten by sharks.
Yes, you're like, oh, wait, it would be more fun to imagine that, this mercenary's wife is getting eaten by sharks, so I'm going to do. And meanwhile, the game is going to reward you, right? Give you morality points for being a good person, right? Right. I was thinking of an example where you save a village, right? And that brings about better consequences for the village, but you only want to do that because there's a store in the village that really gives you good prices, and that's really better for you, right?
Right.
It seems it would be wrong to give you morality points for it, right? Or
yeah, I mean, it really feels like, as we've sort of proven, we have all these uncertainties, right? We don't know honestly. All right. So in both cases, one of these wives is going to die, but we don't know how other people feel about that. Right? One of them might have had 100 friends, and the other one was hated by everyone.
True, and the utilitarian would want all that stuff in there, right?
Right.
Though, of course,
and there's no way you could possibly know it all.
Right. Which is, so I don't think you can have a utilitarian type system in a game that would be fair to the player.
Right. Right. It would have to be limited in some way. It would have to be it would be some sort of truncated utilitarianism.
Right. Do you have you watched The Good Place?
No.
Okay, you should check out The Good Place. It's
all right.
It's a great show, and one of the lead characters is a moral philosopher, and there's no other show ever that has a moral philosopher as a character. But in there, right, so The Good Place is based on this idea that, right, your good and bad actions are tabulated, but it turns out in the last season that they're tabulated on essentially more or less a consequentialist way, so that, you shouldn't be doing things like supporting slave labor. Right. But these days, it's so hard to know because our lives are so complicated if you're supporting slave labor when you're buying something. Right. So, right, these limitations for knowledge, right, really, really matters. And what ends up is everybody ends up going to the bad place instead of the good place because no one can really even see what good or bad is. Okay. So to go back for the intentions thing, right.
Right.
There's this other kind of idea of, maybe we can measure your intention, but how do you measure intention, right? Number one, it just seems like, how would you know the intention? Now, it's possible in the game, right? Another character from your party might ask you why'd you do that, right? Which I think is kind of cool. I'd like a sidekick to kind of ask you why. It's a very good way of creating ethical reflection.
Right.
And maybe based on your why, you can get points for morality in some way.
Right. Now, are you going to still have just a list of choices to pick from, or do you get to input your own?
Right. That's the problem.
Again,
this is where if you're just if you've got a tabletop game, right, you could do a lot with it. But right. So notice, right, that is really a problem. You're restricted. The restrictions might not be your real reason. Your intention, you might make up your intention to what you think strategically would work in the game. Okay, so that's one thing. Then you have this other problem with utilitarianism. It also doesn't get at what kind of character you are, right? You can do the right thing, but still be a pretty lame person. Right. Again, one reason for that could be your intention. Right. You did the right thing, but you did it for the wrong reason. So the philosopher Aristotle, essentially, and I think we've talked about this before in some episode. I can't remember anymore. right? The idea of to be a good person, to live a good life, you need to do it essentially not just for the right reason, but with the right attitude, from the right nature. You needed to be a certain kind of person, a person with good character traits, the virtues, right?
Right.
So there's one game that kind of tried to do this, and that game is one of my favorite games of all time. So Ultima 4, oh my God, I'm so excited to just talk about it. Ultima 4, I think it was made in 1984 when I was in like 7th grade. And it was it was like, were we at 8-bit? I think we were at 8-bit. I played it on my Commodore 128. And that's 128K, y'all. And it had like a big map, and it was an RPG with like a big map and color graphics. It was amazing for the time. It was the biggest RPG I think up to that point. But
it was huge.
It was huge, right? I mean, I remember spending like 4 months playing it, and I would ditch school all the time to come home and play it. And it had this really unusual aspect to it, which is, right, your normal RPGs, you've got a quest, you essentially, advance in terms of your character traits, but your character traits in the old kind of D&D way, right? Where your agility, your dexterity, your strength, your intelligence, right? All that kind of stuff. And eventually you fight bigger monsters and you face the big boss, right? In Ultima 4, the goal was instead for you to become the perfect person, the avatar, right?
Right.
And the game didn't tell you how to do that. You're just kind of supposed to go in this big open world, and you go on quests and you meet people, and you can talk to people and you can interact with people. And this is 1984. This is so long ago.
And how is it feeding back? Like, were you leveling up towards goodness?
Yes.
How did that work?
Okay. So you're leveling up. Well, yes and no. So goodness was divided into 8 categories. So instead of thinking in terms of good and bad, because the Greeks didn't think about good and bad, they thought about having a good character. So you had character virtues like honor, compassion, spirituality, honesty. Right. So
because they had sort of figured out that good was kind of undefinable. You had to sort of break it down into these types of good. You were ideally meant to be all of them.
Right.
As much as you could.
It's interesting because Aristotle thought that you couldn't be one without the others, that they all kind of rose and fell together, because the trick was to figure out what it takes to get a good character virtue. But that'll take us too far out. But this idea that you're in this game and you need to figure out how to make your character become more courageous, right? And just like Aristotle had in mind, the way you become more courageous is through habit. Now I remember we talked about this before. We talked about video game habits and how your habits can create you, right? So you essentially create your character through your habits in the game, right? You run away from a battle, that's a lack of courage, right? You face up to a strong opponent, right? That shows courage. I'm just making this stuff up. I think running away from a battle did take off courage points, but I don't remember what gave you courage points. And again, this
probably running away from a battle that you were probably not ready to win would probably give you wisdom points.
Well, it didn't. And to me, this was always problematic. I thought that this idea of it was wise. It's, it is stupid, not courageous, to rush into a battle you can't win. And in fact, that fits in with what Aristotle kind of faced it. But, I think this was just kind of the limit of the programming, and how do you decide how to do this?
Well,
I mean, I guess there are ways to program this that are not that difficult.
It's not
right.
I mean, right. Back in the time, though, there were more complications now than there are. We can do a lot more now than we could before, just because of the issues of the machines we're working with.
God, I can't believe we're talking about almost 40 years ago.
I know it. It's nuts.
So anyway, so there were things like how do you become compassionate? Well, you figure out, for example, that you can give gold to like the beggars, right? So the game had you incrementally, right, building up your virtues, and it would be counting them in that way, right? And it would let you figure it out. And it had one other really cool thing.
And it was showing you these scores as you went. It wasn't
Yes.
like hiding them from you, and then a big reveal at the end.
That's right.
But you're a terrible person.
Right, because or it could, so notice this is one of course, the interesting design questions of what do you do when you do have a morality system, right? Do you tell the people the morality scores, or do you keep that hidden and do certain things with it?
Well, it depends entirely on whether you've given them explicit goals to achieve. Like in this case, you have been given an explicit goal to become a better person.
I need to know how close I am to that goal.
You absolutely need to get feedback along the way.
Right. So in this case, you really needed to, and you can gain these virtues, and you can also lose them. Right. Mm-hmm. So you had to maintain a balance between these things, and the game sometimes would face you with dilemmas that required you to really kind of choose and lose one or the other. Right.
Right. That's super interesting.
It's just I don't understand why there's never been a remake of this game. Or I think there was a remake in production at some point, but this never made it. But the other really cool thing about this game was that in the beginning, and this is like a medieval RPG, right? So it's kind of classic in that, right? But you enter there's a mist around you, and you walk through the mist, and there's an old gypsy woman, and she puts these 2 tarot cards in front of you, and she tells you a story, and you have to choose one of them, right? And the story would be like, you have sworn loyalty to a lord, and you have to essentially, obey him. But your lord engages in the forbidden practice of torture, right? Every night you hear the screams of his prisoners, right? Do you let them escape and use compassion? Or are you going to stay with loyalty and honor, right?
Right.
And, like a set of 7 dilemmas, where the dilemmas would essentially, what Lord British wanted, the designer, he wanted them to be a reflection of who you are. Mm-hmm. So he wanted the game to be essentially, you would do these kinds of dilemmas, and you would start the game with a character that matches your own current kind of disposition. And you would then, as a proxy for yourself, go out in the world and try to figure out the rest.
Right. That's a common trope in early RPGs, is to try to put you, the player, into the world, as opposed to giving you a character to play. Right.
Though, as I don't know if anyone has ever gone in this particular kind of direction, where the you that they want in the game is specifically the moral you, right? Where they're trying to identify. I think they said they gave people like not personality taste, but they had them like rank and hierarchy the virtues, and it matched what they chose in the game, and it got them to think that they succeeded in this part. Okay, Andy. So let me ask you this: why? So this is a morality system. It's one that I found super, super interesting. Why aren't there more games with morality systems like this?
One hand, I think that it's, to a certain degree, they did it. It's been done, right? And to a certain degree, a lot of game designers are more interested in doing the next thing that hasn't been done. Now, one could argue that it hasn't been done well, and you could improve upon it, right?
Right.
And so, can we do this better now? Of course we could. We could do it a lot better now.
Right. Though it's interesting. Is this something we can build on?
Yeah, I think so. There's another question, too, of does anybody want this?
Right.
I mean, clearly you do.
Right. And I count for one, right?
Right. And Lord British wanted it, but I'd be interested in knowing whether or not he ever wanted to do it again. Like, why hasn't he done it again?
I see. I mean, for him, you would really think that he did it. But yeah, I don't know I think they tried some things with Ultima 5 and Ultima 6, but kind of ended up abandoning it. But yeah, maybe it is I always wondered if someone could do something like this, but somewhat different. And I'm not sure exactly how, but give me enough time and I'll come up with something, damn it.
Right. Well, I think we should do this as an exercise, maybe on another episode coming up.
That would be fun.
We'll just try to figure it out. Let's just try to design it and figure out how to make it work.
I love it. All right, Andy, let me ask you this. So I had one more thing that I wanted to talk about.
Okay.
I think I told you that I have one game that I've designed. That's it.
Right.
That's as far
Right.
as my game designer career goes. Right. This is a game I made up for my business ethics class. I wanted to teach business ethics in a way that really involved my students more in actually making ethical decisions. But the idea of making it into a game just seemed really attractive because that would give them motivation and all that. But I was like, but how do I score the ethics? Because that's what this class is about. So
Right.
I came up with something that I thought that worked really well in the classroom, right? But I don't know, how it could work or if it could work in video games per se. So the idea was I essentially put them into three companies. So they're like the ethics advisory board for three companies. These are based on like Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft. Right?
Okay.
Yahoo.
So three big tech giant companies.
Three big tech giant companies at the time. They were based on those because those were the big ones at the time. I think I did this in 2009 or something, or 8.
Right.
And the idea there is we took like 4 weeks to do this game. So this game takes place over like literally 48 hours or something. So it's pretty long, right? Where each week they have a scenario, and their scenario has to do with various, let's say one is like issues in human resources, another one's issues in marketing, another one has to do with privacy and censorship. And for each of these, the teams have to respond to the situation that their company faces and make suggestions. Now, these are ethical conditions ethical problems in all of these cases that they need to deal with. And instead of scoring them on whether they gave the right answer, the idea was to score them on whether their thinking process about it was good. So their method of ethical reflection. So what I did is I taught them a method for ethical reflection. So this is something I use in my video game class as well. And I've used it in a lot of classes. It's kind of like a step-by-step. Here's how you make a good ethical decision, right?
Okay.
And it has kind of 3 sections. One is you're becoming morally aware, and you're doing the work to become morally aware, and you're showing them morally aware. One is you're actually giving reasons, and the third is you're coming up with an effective implementation strategy to actually practically do something right, not just idealistically do it right?
Okay.
So I had my teams essentially write the responses to challenges for each round, and once they would write their responses, then there would be like a switch. 3 other groups would rate their responses, and they would score their responses based on how good they were at moral awareness, moral reasons, and implementation.
What was I take it there was some sort of grading, like here's how to grade these. How do you do that?
Right. That's and obviously there's a subjective element to this, right?
Right.
So essentially it's we've learned the method, right? So let's say for moral awareness, right? Did they discuss the relevant facts? Right? Because you need to think about the relevant facts. Did they consider the stakeholders, right? Who might be impacted by this? And the stakes that those stakeholders might suffer. And did they come up with a list of options, right, to choose from, right? That didn't just have the obvious options, right? And based on how well they did all this, I had them essentially give them like a score of 1 to 5. 5, they did an excellent job. So notice it's a subjective rating based on stated criteria of what would be good.
Right, and the criterion is all about process and not about result. Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. And with this, right, we would tabulate the scores after each round, so so the teams would know it. I had extra credit for the ultimate, team that won this at the very, very end for motivation. And as a game, it went really great.
I bet
it's one of those things where you can take. Where gamification and sometimes there's a rush to gamify almost everything, but sometimes gamification education can just be fantastic, right?
Mhm.
And okay, but I did this for that game, and as we looked at these kinds of morality systems, if you think more broadly about about games, is there a kind of way to do this? So you're making a game that uses, instead of looking at the answers that people made, looks at the process somehow. How would you
Mhm.
do something like this in a video game? Can you do something like this in a video game?
Yes, I think you can. All of the things that you're asking them to do would have to be actions to take
Right.
or not to take, right? And like going in and looking at how that affects the stakeholders, for example, would have to be an action that you could actually do.
I see. Considering your
Right.
stakeholders would be an action you actually do.
Right.
Right.
So how would you do that in a game? You would convene, there would be some sort of action, right? I'm convening a group of people, a survey of the people who would be affected by this, and we're having a meeting, and now and I'm hearing their feedback.
Right. Interesting. Or potentially, right, can leave it up to you to go out and, interview the potential people that might be impacted. Right. It depends on how easy or obvious we want to make it for the player to do that. Right. And that will show
Right.
that you gathered some sort of information, and maybe mark the information that you think is important. Right.
Mhm.
I mean, potentially you can even have like, you could even teach the player, look, here's what you really kind of need to go through before you feel like you've made a good decision. And sometimes games ask you, are you sure you've collected enough evidence so you feel like you've got a good decision?
Right.
Right. So, it could be kind of like that. You've got these kind of steps, you kind of know what the steps are, but you may
Mhm.
not have followed the steps very well.
Right.
And the game,
Now, if and you have a specific order of steps too, which sounds like, so you want to make sure that players do them in the correct order.
right, because if you came up with your options before you really kind of looked at your stakeholders, right,
Mhm.
you wouldn't really be able to. You need to think about the rights and responsibilities involved. You need to think of your stakeholders. You need to know the facts, right?
Right. Right.
And if you don't know the facts, you can't even come up with the stakes for your stakeholders. You can't even know what the stakeholders are. So yeah, you need to have this kind of step-by-step way. So okay, so something like this is possible, even in this way. I was thinking of something more. I remember originally I was thinking that God, it sure would be nice if I could, build an app or something that
Mhm.
could, because this was part of, I had to do this all in paper, and that
Right.
part was really hard. And then I made I think a Google spreadsheet at some point that I had them, but I didn't want all of them being able to see each other's score, and it got if we just had an app that kind of walked them through it.
Yeah.
Can you do something like this can you do a game that is kind of based around this idea kind of to begin with? So where you're taking this kind of either team approach or individual approach, but essentially people submit things that are, let's say, in writing.
Mhm.
So it requires subjective judgment, but now you're doing it online with masses of people
Right.
that are kind of, where you get like an average score or something like that.
Yeah. There'd be plenty of people who would be willing to. I mean, people love to judge other people.
We
So
do, yes.
you give them. The only real problem is that you don't necessarily know whether the people are judging people by the rules
Right.
that you have provided.
Right.
Right. And you don't even know that in the classroom.
Right.
Right. These people are being judged, but you don't really know if they're following your instructions or not.
Well, I do know because I'm going around and listening to them talk.
Oh, okay.
Right. That's
So-
and that I'm giving
But
them.
when you're not there, when they're like, all right, he's out of earshot. Let's give him a 6.
Right. Though, the people are right there also, right? It's harder to be a troll when there's people, in the same room with you.
Right.
But yeah, that seems like a really big problem. Also your motivation. My students had a lot of motivation for playing this game according to the rules. I mean, dude, otherwise they could listen to a professor drone. And instead, 4 weeks of the semester, they got to play a game.
Which is great.
Yeah,
super fun.
For them, it was super fun. The motivation, and their motivation is extra credit and a good grade, right, for participation. Right. But if you put this on something like this online, God, I could just imagine the kind of trollish responses that you would get.
Right. So what you'd have to do is you'd have to have some community standards for your judges, and then you'd have to let other people rate the people based on their. I mean, I've been thinking about this in terms of like just building a social network,
right?
Having people rate other people on their ability to follow rules,
right?
And then giving their voices a weight based on how many other people think that they're doing well.
Right.
I mean, eBay does this to a certain degree, right? I don't know if you've ever bought anything off of eBay.
A couple of times.
But when you do, the seller rates you as a buyer,
right?
And you rate the seller.
Sure.
And then you can look at the seller's, ratings and say. And
we do this with lots of things now, right? I mean,
we do this for lots of
right?
things,
your Lyft driver does that, right? He rates you. You rate them. The Airbnb people do that, right?
Right, and there's abuses that come of that.
Right.
But overall, it kind of works pretty well. The aspect of it that you can sort of look at is to say, all right, this person tends to give everybody a 1-star review.
Right.
How much do we care about that guy's opinions?
Right. So the algorithm could actually, or my son rates everything awesome. Every single class my son has ever taken has given a 5-star rating to.
In the Olympics, they throw out the highest and the lowest scores. Like the Olympic gymnasts, and you get the people hold up the signs. You're like, and a 10-point and 10 points from the Russian judge. Right. Before they average them and give them a final score, they throw out the highest and the lowest.
Really?
That's just the rule.
Right. So presumably you come up with an AI, right? That that looks at this stuff and figures. Maybe one of these days you and I can think of an actual game that does something like this, and get some details. All right. For now, let's call it a podcast. Good podcast, right. Andy.
Good podcast.
Let's play nice.
You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.